Early morning in a quiet rural subdivision outside the fictional town of Briar Glen, Tennessee, I stepped onto my porch with a mug of coffee, expecting nothing more than birds and breeze, but instead I heard a metallic scream that did not belong in sunrise silence. It was the kind of grinding roar that makes your stomach drop before your mind even understands why. I followed the sound to the edge of my yard and froze. A bulldozer blade was chewing straight through the cedar fence my great-grandfather built more than a century ago, splinters flying like shattered memories. Standing beside the machine was the HOA board leader, Denise Harper, arms folded, expression cold, watching it happen like she owned the land itself. I shouted for the operator to stop. He hesitated. She lifted her hand and motioned him forward. In that instant, it stopped being about neighborhood rules and became a personal war over heritage, boundaries, and dignity. My hands shook, not from fear but from clarity. I pulled out my phone and started recording, realizing this was going to be bigger than a fence. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? That fence was never just a boundary line to me. It was a timeline. A family album standing upright in the dirt. My great-grandfather, Samuel Whitaker, cut those cedar boards by hand in the summer of 1923, long before this area had paved roads or property associations or printed rulebooks. I grew up hearing the story of how he hauled the timber himself with a mule cart, shaping each plank with tools that would look primitive by today's standards. My grandmother used to say he chose cedar because it smelled like forever, and even decades later, when the sun hit the boards just right, that scent still rose from the wood like a quiet reminder that some things were meant to last longer than the people who built them. When I was a kid, my father would take me along whenever he went to reinforce a loose post or replace a cracked rail. He never rushed those moments. He would hand me a square of sandpaper and let me smooth the rough edges while he checked the nails in alignment. I remember the way sawdust stuck to my sneakers and how proud I felt when he stepped back and nodded at a section we had worked on together. Those afternoons were not about maintenance. They were about inheritance. The fence marked more than property lines. It marked responsibility, patience, and the idea that land was not something you owned for a few years, but something you borrowed from the past and protected for the future. So when I eventually bought the house that stood on that same stretch of land, it felt less like a purchase and more like a return. The neighborhood itself looked peaceful at first glance. Tree-lined streets, evenly spaced mailboxes, tidy lawns. The Homeowners Association welcomed me with a cheerful packet of glossy brochures, a laminated card of community guidelines, and smiles that felt rehearsed but harmless. They talked about maintaining visual harmony and protecting property values. At the time, it sounded reasonable. I had lived in apartments most of my adult life, places where you could hear your neighbor sneeze through the wall. The idea of organized order did not seem threatening. It felt like structure, maybe even stability. The first few weeks passed without incident. Then a small envelope appeared in my mailbox with the HOA logo printed in blue ink. Inside was a polite reminder that my mailbox color did not match the approved palette. I laughed it off. It was minor, almost comical. I repainted it the following weekend and moved on. A month later, another letter arrived about grass height, suggesting it exceeded the preferred visual range. That one annoyed me slightly, but I still treated it like background noise, the kind of bureaucratic fuss that comes with shared living spaces. I trimmed the lawn earlier than I normally would and told myself it was no big deal. But the letters did not stop. They multiplied. A notice about a decorative wind chime being audibly disruptive. A reminder about trash bins being visible for too long after collection day. Each message was written in the same neutral tone, but together they began to feel less like guidance and more like surveillance. Around that time, I started noticing Denise Harper more often. She would drive slowly down the street in a silver sedan, phone raised just slightly above the steering wheel, lens angled toward houses. At first I assumed she was checking addresses. Then I realized she was photographing properties, mine included. Neighbors noticed too, but they rarely said anything directly. Conversations would soften when her car rolled by. A few people exchanged knowing looks, but no one openly criticized her. It was as if the entire subdivision had agreed, silently, that resistance was not worth the trouble. I convinced myself that common sense would eventually balance things out. After all, I was not violating anything serious. The fence had stood there longer than any of these homes had existed. Surely that counted for something. Then the first official violation notice arrived, stamped in red ink across the top. Non-compliant structure. The letter claimed my cedar fence did not meet current community standards and requested corrective action within 30 days. I read it twice, then a third time, certain I had misunderstood. That fence was older than the HOA itself. It predated every house on the block. How could something that ancient suddenly be out of bounds? I pulled out the HOA map from the welcome packet and spread it across my kitchen table. The boundary lines looked imprecise, almost hand-drawn. Measurements overlapped in odd ways. Sections were labeled with abbreviations that were never explained. The more I studied it, the less confident I felt about its accuracy. Doubt crept in quietly at first, then settled in my chest like a weight. The HOA was no longer a background nuisance sending petty reminders. It had shifted into something larger, something capable of rewriting history with a printed letter and a signature. And for the first time, I realized that what I had dismissed as minor inconveniences might actually be early warning signs of a much bigger conflict waiting just ahead. I decided the smartest move was diplomacy. Escalation felt reckless, and I still believed there had to be a reasonable explanation buried somewhere beneath the formal language in stamped envelopes. When a flyer appeared in my mailbox announcing a community social and standards discussion at the neighborhood clubhouse, I took it as an opportunity. The wording sounded friendly enough, and I convinced myself this was where misunderstandings would be cleared up over coffee and polite conversation rather than letters and penalties. The clubhouse that evening smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and overbrewed coffee. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a projector hummed quietly in the corner even though nothing was displayed on the screen. People spoke in low voices, the kind you use in waiting rooms or court buildings. Denise Harper stood near the refreshment table with a clipboard tucked against her side like a badge of office. When she smiled, it looked practiced, the corners of her mouth lifting without reaching her eyes. I waited until a lull in conversation, then approached her with what I thought was a simple, respectful question. I asked for clarification about the fence notice. I explained its age, its historical significance to my family, and my willingness to cooperate if there were legitimate concerns. Denise listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, but when she responded, her words sounded like they had been memorized from a handbook. She spoke in legal phrases, referencing community compliance standards and uniform visual guidelines. Every sentence was structured to avoid responsibility. She never said yes or no. She never acknowledged history. Instead, she implied that delays in compliance could result in escalating fines, delivered in a tone so calm it felt almost rehearsed. It was not a conversation, it was a performance designed to end without resolution. I left that meeting with a tightness in my chest that I could not shake. The next morning, I called a local handyman, a man named Victor Hale, who had worked on several older homes in the county. He arrived with a measuring tape and a small tool bag, running his fingers along the cedar grain the way a mechanic listens to an engine. After an hour of inspection, he told me the fence was structurally sound. The posts were firm, the rails intact. In his words, it was built better than half the new ones going up these days. His assessment gave me a brief sense of relief, as if logic had finally stepped into the room. That relief lasted exactly 3 days. Another letter arrived, this one more direct than the last. It stated that removal was required within 30 days, or the association would pursue corrective measures. The phrasing was colder, stripped of courtesy. The paper itself felt heavier in my hands, though I knew it was just standard stock. I responded by email, outlining the handyman's findings and again asking for specific guidelines that the fence supposedly violated. The reply came within hours, but it was clearly a template. No greeting, no acknowledgement of my points, just a restatement of policy and a reminder of deadlines. It read less like correspondence and more like an automated warning system that had learned to type. Around this time, neighbors began opening up. Conversations that once stayed surface level shifted into quiet confessions at mailboxes and driveway edges. A retired schoolteacher named Linda Foster showed me a notice she received for leaving a garden hose coiled on her porch. A young couple mentioned a warning about the shade of their front door paint. The stories accumulated like receipts no one wanted but everyone kept. Then, one afternoon, while I was checking the mail, an elderly resident named Carl Benton approached me with a folded sheet of paper in his trembling hand. He told me he had been cited for a bird feeder hanging from a tree branch. Not for its size or safety, but because it disrupted visual consistency. His voice carried a mix of embarrassment and disbelief, as if he still could not fully accept that such a small thing had been treated as a violation. Each new story tightened the knot in my stomach. What had once seemed like minor inconveniences were revealing a pattern, a system that thrived on precision without compassion. I tried one more round of mediation through email, carefully wording my message to avoid confrontation while still asserting reason. The response was identical in structure to the previous one, as if my words had been fed into a machine that produced the same cold output, regardless of input. That was the moment frustration hardened into something more focused. Confusion gave way to anger, but it was not reckless anger. It was the kind that sharpens your thoughts instead of clouding them. The tone of the HOA communications shifted as well. The language grew more authoritative, less disguised behind friendliness. Phrases like non-negotiable compliance and enforcement timeline began appearing. Every envelope carried a subtle sense of threat, a reminder that they believed time was on their side. I started waking earlier, checking the fence line almost instinctively, half expecting to find survey stakes or warning tape already planted. The idea of them taking physical action no longer felt dramatic or unlikely. It felt procedural, like the next step in a checklist they had already decided to complete. By then, the bulldozer incident had not yet happened, but it hovered in my mind like a storm you can smell before you see the clouds. The emotional shift was undeniable. I was no longer asking whether this would escalate. I was asking when, and beneath the rising anger, there was a steady current of determination forming, the realization that if diplomacy only produced rehearsed phrases and automated replies, then the next move would have to be something stronger, something rooted not just in emotion but in evidence and resolve. The morning after the bulldozer tore through the cedar line, the yard looked like a memory that had been dragged across gravel. Broken boards lay scattered in uneven piles, nails bent like crooked teeth, and the scent of fresh split cedar mixed with diesel fumes that still clung to the air. I walked the length of the damage slowly, filming every splintered post and crushed rail. Anger was there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer loud or explosive. It was quiet, focused, almost clinical. I realized that shouting had done nothing. Evidence might do everything. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with the county records office, navigating a maze of automated menus until a real voice finally answered. I explained the situation, expecting bureaucracy, but instead, I heard curiosity. The clerk asked for the parcel number, paused for a long moment, then told me there were original land plats stored in their archive dating back more than a century. She mentioned that boundary disputes were not uncommon and that an independent surveyor named Owen Caldwell often handled cases where association lines conflicted with historical records. The name felt like a small beam of light cutting through fog. For the first time since the bulldozer arrived, I felt something close to hope. That hope was tested within hours. An email notification appeared on my phone with the HOA logo at the top and the subject line labeled, Restoration Fee Assessment. The document inside demanded thousands of dollars for debris removal and uniformity correction, as if the destruction they ordered was somehow my responsibility to clean up. The language was sterile, stripped of context, as if the fence had simply fallen over on its own and the association had generously offered assistance at a price. Reading it felt surreal, like being billed for damage done to your own belongings. The absurdity might have been laughable if it were not so brazen. I printed the notice, folded it once, and drove straight to Denise Harper's house. Her driveway was immaculate, bordered by trimmed hedges that looked measured with a ruler. She stepped outside before I even reached the door, as if she had been expecting confrontation. I held up the paper and asked calmly how it was possible to charge me for removing debris created by equipment she authorized. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply repeated that the HOA agreement granted them authority over non-compliant structures and that enforcement costs were outlined in the bylaws. Her confidence rested entirely on paperwork. on the assumption that printed rules outweighed lived history. It was not arrogance in the loud sense. It was a quiet certainty that systems always favored whoever controlled the documents. Standing there, I noticed something that shifted everything. Denise never mentioned measurements, surveys, or physical proof. She only referenced clauses and sections, lines of text that sounded impressive but felt detached from the ground itself. It dawned on me that her authority existed on paper more than in reality. She believed intimidation through documentation would end the argument before it ever reached facts. That realization cooled my anger into something sharper. I stopped trying to win the conversation. I simply told her I would be reviewing the original land records and walked away before she could reply. Back home, I opened my laptop and scheduled a full land survey with Owen Caldwell's office. The confirmation email arrived within minutes, listing equipment, estimated duration, and a date circled in digital ink that suddenly felt like a countdown to clarity. The act of scheduling it changed my posture, even the way I breathed. I was no longer reacting to letters or responding to threats. I was preparing proof. Every photograph I had taken, every notice I had saved, every conversation replayed in my mind began arranging itself into a timeline instead of a tangle. The tone of the situation shifted internally before it shifted externally. Where there had been restless anger, there was now deliberate focus. I created folders on my computer, labeled them by date, scanned documents, and backed up videos. The fence was still broken outside, but inside my head the pieces were beginning to align. The bulldozer incident, which had felt like an act of raw aggression, now looked more like an overstep waiting to be documented. Denise's reliance on printed authority had unintentionally revealed her vulnerability. She assumed the past could be overwritten with current bylaws. I was about to test that assumption with records older than the association itself. That day marked a pivot I could feel in my bones. Until then, I had been defending memories and appealing to reason. Now I was assembling evidence and preparing for verification. The fight was no longer emotional or abstract. It had coordinates, dates, and soon it would have measurements carved into official reports. The broken cedar boards in the yard no longer looked like defeat. They looked like the opening exhibit in a case that was finally moving from defense to offense. The decision to stop reacting and start preparing changed the way I moved through the neighborhood. Instead of avoiding eye contact or rushing from car to door, I slowed down. I carried my phone with the bulldozer footage saved and a small folder of printed notices tucked under my arm. The first house I visited belonged to Maya Lopez, a single mother who lived 2 doors down. She answered with a cautious smile that shifted into disbelief the moment I showed her the video. The roar of the machine, the splintering cedar, Denise's raised hand telling the operator to continue. It was different seeing it on a screen than hearing about it in passing. Maya stepped outside and closed her door behind her, as if the walls might be listening. Within minutes, she returned with a stack of envelopes tied together with a rubber band. Violation letters, each more trivial than the last. Paint shade discrepancies. Decorative lights considered seasonally inappropriate. She handed them to me like evidence she had been waiting for someone to acknowledge. Word spread faster than I expected. By the time I reached the third house, people already knew why I was there. Doors opened before I knocked. Stories poured out, sometimes hesitant, sometimes angry, but always relieved. The shared thread was exhaustion. Everyone had been dealing with small, relentless pressures that felt insignificant alone but oppressive together. What surprised me most was how quickly fear began to give way to curiosity. The bulldozer footage was not just proof of overreach. It was a crack in the illusion that the HOA's authority was untouchable. One afternoon, I met Thomas Reed while walking back from the mailbox. He was a retired veteran with a posture that still carried quiet discipline despite his years. When I mentioned the survey appointment and showed him the video, he watched without interrupting, arms folded, expression steady. When it ended, he simply nodded and said that if the matter reached a public meeting, he would speak. His voice held the calm certainty of someone who had faced bigger conflicts and knew the value of standing firm. That offer carried more weight than a dozen complaints. It signaled that this was no longer a private dispute. It was becoming a collective stand. The day Owen Caldwell arrived felt different from the start. His truck pulled up with surveying equipment neatly secured in the back and a tube of rolled county maps tucked under his arm. He moved with quiet confidence, measuring distances, placing small markers, and comparing the land to records that dated back generations. Neighbors watched from porches and sidewalks, curiosity replacing hesitation. Owen explained in simple terms that preliminary indicators suggested the HOA boundary line might have been drawn incorrectly when the subdivision expanded years ago. The implication was enormous. It meant the fence had likely stood on rightful ground all along. Hearing that possibility spoken aloud shifted the atmosphere from cautious optimism to cautious excitement. Denise's response came swiftly. Emails began appearing in inboxes across the neighborhood, labeled as urgent notices about unauthorized gatherings and non-compliant community discussions. The language was sharper than before, almost frantic beneath its formal tone. Instead of reassuring residents, the warnings revealed something else entirely: fear. The more she tried to contain conversations, the more obvious it became that the narrative was slipping from her control. Authority that once felt absolute now looked brittle, dependent on silence rather than certainty. I decided to lean into the momentum rather than wait for it to fade. That evening, I set up folding chairs on my porch and sent out simple invitations through text messages and word of mouth. No official flyers, no dramatic announcements, just an open invitation to talk. The turnout surprised me. Neighbors arrived with documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. The porch that once held quiet afternoon memories now buzzed with shared determination. We agreed on a twofold plan: allow Owen to complete the full survey without interference, and gather every letter, fine, and photograph into a collective folder to present at the next HOA assembly. It was not a rebellion. It was organization. The most unexpected development came from Thomas Reed a few days later. He invited me over and led me into his attic, where boxes of old papers sat stacked beneath the rafters. Inside one of them was a deed copy dating back decades, its edges yellowed, but the text still legible. The document contained boundary markers that aligned almost perfectly with the cedar fence line. Seeing those measurements printed long before the HOA existed felt like discovering a missing chapter of a book everyone else thought had been rewritten. It was not just supportive evidence. It was historical confirmation. Hope, which had started as a fragile idea, transformed into momentum. Conversations grew louder, shoulders straighter, and glances less guarded. The neighborhood was no longer whispering about rules. It was discussing records, surveys, and next steps. What began as a personal effort to defend a fence had evolved into a community effort to clarify truth. The plan was no longer about reacting to Denise's letters or avoiding her gaze. It was about walking into the next assembly with proof in hand and voices united, shifting the balance from isolated frustration to collective confidence. Survey day arrived with the kind of stillness that never feels peaceful. The air was clear, the sky wide and bright, yet everything underneath it seemed tight, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Owen Caldwell's truck rolled in just after sunrise, the back loaded with tripods, measuring poles, and a hard plastic case that clicked open with a sound that reminded me of courtroom briefcases in old movies. He greeted me with a calm nod, but even his steady presence could not completely cut through the tension humming in my chest. Within minutes of him stepping onto the property, Denise Harper's silver sedan appeared at the end of the street. She did not park. She circled slowly, once, then again, as if motion alone could assert authority. The sunlight flashed off her windshield each time she passed, a silent reminder that she was watching. I caught glimpses of her phone lifted just high enough to suggest photographs were being taken. The repetition was deliberate. She wanted the survey to feel intrusive, unofficial, something out of bounds even though it was entirely legal. Instead, it only sharpened my focus. Every loop she made around the block felt like confirmation that this process mattered more than she wanted to admit. Owen moved with quiet efficiency, planting small colored markers into the soil and stretching measuring tape across distances that looked ordinary, until you realized they carried decades of consequence. He compared coordinates against old county maps spread across the hood of his truck, tracing lines with a pencil that had been sharpened so many times it was barely half its original length. After an hour, he stepped closer to me and spoke in a tone meant only for my ears. The fence line, he explained, appeared to predate the HOA boundary by decades. The association's map was likely drawn during a later expansion without reconciling the original land records. Hearing those words felt like the first deep breath after weeks of shallow ones. It was not a victory yet, but it was a confirmation that the ground beneath my feet held truth older than any printed bylaw. While Owen worked, I prepared for what came next. Inside my house, the dining table transformed into a command center of documents. Photographs of the bulldozer damage lay in neat stacks beside printed emails, violation notices, and scanned deed copies. I highlighted key phrases, clipped pages together, and arranged everything in chronological order. The act of organizing turned anxiety into purpose. Each paper was a piece of a puzzle finally forming a clear image. I reached out to neighbors who had offered to speak, confirming their willingness and making sure their documents were ready. Thomas Reed's voice over the phone carried steady assurance. Maya Lopez texted photos of her letters already printed and filed. Coordination replaced uncertainty, and with each confirmation, the weight on my shoulders shifted from fear to responsibility. By late afternoon, word spread that the HOA had scheduled an emergency meeting for that very evening. The announcement arrived through email with bold lettering and formal language, but its urgency revealed more than it concealed. Rumors followed almost immediately. Some residents whispered that Denise planned to issue multiple fines at once, hoping to overwhelm anyone considering public opposition. Others believed she intended to question the legality of the survey itself. Whether true or not, the effect was the same. Anxiety rippled through the neighborhood like wind across tall grass. Conversations at mailboxes grew hushed but intense. People checked their phones repeatedly, rereading the notice as if hidden meanings might surface on the second or third glance. I spent the early evening rehearsing what I would say. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I practiced balancing emotion with facts, reminding myself that anger might be understandable, but clarity would be more effective. I wanted my words to carry the weight of history without sounding like nostalgia, to present evidence without losing the human story behind it. Each rehearsal trimmed unnecessary phrases, leaving only what mattered most. Outside, the sky shifted from gold to deep blue, and porch lights flickered on one by one, tiny signals that the entire street was preparing for the same moment. The neighborhood's energy felt different as the hour approached. People who once avoided eye contact now exchanged nods of encouragement. Doors opened and closed with purposeful rhythm. Cars backed out of driveways almost in unison, headlights forming a quiet procession toward the community hall. It was not loud or chaotic. It was deliberate. The shared understanding that something decisive was about to happen hung in the air, heavy but steady. When I stepped out of my car in the parking lot, I saw neighbors gathering near the entrance, documents tucked under arms, shoulders squared. No one needed a speech to know why they were there. The glass doors reflected our silhouettes as we approached together, and for a brief moment the building seemed larger than it had ever been, its windows dark like watchful eyes. We moved inside as a group, the echo of our footsteps carrying down the corridor. Conversations faded into murmurs, then into silence. The atmosphere thickened, charged with anticipation and uncertainty, like storm clouds pressing low over open fields. By the time we entered the main hall and took our seats, the room felt suspended in a quiet that was almost physical, the kind that settles just before thunder. The hall was already full when I stepped inside, the low hum of conversations bouncing off the high ceiling like trapped insects. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted, and every small sound felt amplified by the tension hanging in the air. Denise Harper stood at the front near the long table where the board usually sat, her posture rigid, a folder clutched in both hands. She did not wait for introductions or formalities. The moment the meeting was called to order, she began speaking, her voice sharp and controlled, accusing me of vandalism, of disorderly behavior, of disrupting community harmony. She framed the survey as an unauthorized intrusion and the porch gatherings as attempts to incite unrest. Each sentence was delivered with rehearsed confidence, but beneath the polish there was strain, a slight tightening around her eyes that had not been there weeks earlier. I listened without interruption. The urge to respond immediately pulsed in my chest, but I held it back. When she finally paused, expecting either apology or anger, I simply walked to the front with my folder. The room grew quieter with each step, the shuffle of paper echoing louder than it should have. I placed the survey report on the table, followed by copies of the original deed and the historical plats Owen had referenced. There was no dramatic flourish, no raised voice. Just documents laid out in a neat line, their edges aligned with deliberate care. I spoke calmly, explaining the measurements, the dates, the continuity of the fence line across decades of records. My words were steady not because I lacked emotion, but because I had rehearsed them until clarity replaced nerves. Owen Caldwell rose from his seat when I finished and introduced himself with the simple authority of someone accustomed to disputes that hinge on inches and signatures. He verified the measurements, explained how the HOA boundary map conflicted with earlier county surveys, and described the markers he had placed that morning. His tone was measured and technical, but its effect was immediate. A murmur spread through the hall as people leaned forward, processing the implications. The fence, the structure that had triggered months of warnings in the bulldozer's arrival, had never stood on HOA land at all. The realization moved across the room like a ripple on water, subtle at first, then unmistakable. I connected my phone to the projector cable and played the video footage. The screen lit up with the image of the bulldozer blade cutting through cedar boards, the sound of splintering wood filling the hall. Denise's raised hand signaling the operator forward was unmistakable. Gasps broke the silence, some sharp, others drawn out. The footage did what words could not. It transformed abstract accusations into visible action. Denise shifted in her chair, her earlier confidence dissolving into rigid stillness. She opened her folder as if searching for a response, but the papers inside suddenly looked thin compared to the weight of what everyone had just seen. Neighbors began to stand one by one. Maya Lopez held up copies of violation letters, reading phrases that now sounded hollow against the backdrop of the survey results. Thomas Reed spoke with calm firmness about intimidation tactics and the importance of fairness. Others followed, sharing small but telling examples that, together, painted the pattern impossible to dismiss. Each testimony added another layer of clarity, another voice confirming that what had once felt isolated was in fact systemic. The hall that had entered in anxious silence now filled with steady collective resolve. When the acting board member called for a vote on Denise's removal, the room stilled again, but this time the quiet felt different. It was not uncertainty, it was anticipation. Hands rose slowly at first, then in near unison, filling the air like a field of lifted branches. I counted without meaning to. Only 2 hands remained down, Denise's and a woman seated beside her who looked more uncomfortable than supportive. The rest of the hall stood in quiet agreement. The decision was clear, not through shouting or spectacle, but through the simple, undeniable arithmetic of unity. The emotional release that followed was not loud or chaotic. It was a collective exhale, shoulders dropping, faces softening, the tension that had stretched across months finally loosening its grip. Denise's authority did not shatter with a dramatic sound. It faded in real time, like a spotlight dimming until only ordinary light remained. The woman who had once spoken in unchallengeable clauses now sat surrounded by the same silence she had used to control others. Facts had done what anger never could. Unity had done what individual frustration never managed. The figure who acted invincible was undone, not by retaliation, but by records, measurements, and the simple courage of neighbors choosing to stand together. In the days that followed the vote, the pace of everything seemed to slow, as if the neighborhood itself was catching its breath after a long period of tension. The acting board wasted little time formalizing the outcome. A written agreement arrived in my mailbox, not as a warning or a demand this time, but as a confirmation. It stated clearly that full compensation for the fence destruction would be issued, and that no association representative would step onto my property without written permission. The language was precise, almost cautious, as if the document itself understood the weight of what it was correcting. Another notice followed shortly after, confirming that Denise Harper would be responsible for the repair costs. Seeing her name attached to accountability instead of authority felt surreal, like watching a title quietly change hands without ceremony. The shift in the neighborhood was immediate and unmistakable. Where conversations once dipped into whispers, voices now carried freely across driveways. Neighbors who used to wave quickly before retreating indoors lingered outside, exchanging stories that no longer felt risky to tell. The air seemed lighter, not because the conflict had been dramatic, but because its resolution had been shared. Relief replaced caution, and with relief came a subtle sense of pride. It was not triumph in the loud sense. It was the calm satisfaction of knowing something unfair had been corrected through patience and unity rather than chaos. Rebuilding the fence began almost naturally. I had planned to handle most of it myself, but the first morning I stepped outside with a stack of cedar boards. Thomas Reed was already there, tool belt fastened and measuring tape in hand. He greeted me with a nod that said more than words. A little later, Maya Lopez arrived carrying a small cooler filled with bottled water and lemonade. By midday, several families had joined, some bringing spare nails, others offering extra hands. What could have been a solitary repair turned into a collective effort without anyone formally organizing it. People simply showed up. The rhythm of rebuilding was steady and grounding. The sound of hammers striking nails replaced the memory of the bulldozer's roar. Each post driven into the soil felt like a quiet affirmation that boundaries were being restored, not just physically, but emotionally. Children wandered over with curious eyes, asking questions about the tools and the scent of the wood. Someone suggested letting them paint small cedar plaques with the year and their initials. The idea caught on instantly. Soon, bright colors dotted the fresh boards, small signatures of participation that transformed the fence from a private structure into a shared symbol. It was no longer only my family's history standing there, it was the neighborhood story woven into the grain. The HOA, under its interim leadership, issued revised guidelines acknowledging the corrected survey lines. The document was brief but significant. It referenced updated boundary confirmations and clarified that historical structures predating the association would be evaluated under different standards. The tone lacked the rigid authority of earlier notices. Instead, it read like an administrative correction, a quiet admission that the system had adjusted itself to reality. For many residents, that paper carried more meaning than any apology could have. It signaled that the rules now aligned with facts rather than assumptions. As the fence neared completion, loose ends began closing almost on their own. Compensation checks arrived without delay. Outstanding violation letters were formally withdrawn. Conversations that once revolved around enforcement shifted toward gardening tips and weekend plans. The tension that had once hovered over the street dissipated, replaced by an ease that felt earned rather than accidental. Even simple routines, walking to the mailbox, trimming the lawn, greeting a neighbor, carried a new sense of confidence. Ownership was no longer just legal. It was emotional, grounded in the knowledge that standing together had tangible results. Peace returned gradually, not as a sudden silence, but as a steady hum of normal life resuming with deeper roots. The cedar fence stood again, its fresh boards glowing warmly in the afternoon light, the painted plaques catching reflections like small constellations. It marked the same boundary as before, yet it felt different, stronger. Not because the wood was new, but because the community around it had changed. What once represented private heritage now symbolized collective solidarity. The land had not moved, the measurements had not shifted, but the understanding of what those lines meant had deepened. And in that quiet transformation, the neighborhood discovered that reclaiming boundaries could also reclaim a sense of belonging. I stand beside the newly finished cedar line as the sun sinks low behind the trees, its orange light stretching across the boards like a quiet blessing. I run my hand along the fresh wood, feeling the faint ridges where the grain rises, and for a moment it feels like touching every generation that stood here before me. The fence smells the way I remember from childhood, clean, sharp, almost sweet, and the scent carries memories with it, reminders that some things endure because people choose to protect them. This whole experience taught me something I will not forget. Paper authority means nothing without truth behind it, and silence is the bully's greatest ally. Boundaries are not just property lines drawn on maps. They are stories, memories, and identity woven into the ground beneath your feet. When neighbors stand together and document reality instead of arguing in circles, intimidation loses its weight. I look down the length of the fence and see more than boards and nails. I see Maya's painted plaque, Thomas's careful measurements, the laughter of children who turned rebuilding into celebration. Gratitude settles in where anger once lived. The fence stands taller now, not because it reaches higher into the sky, but because it represents unity and dignity restored. It is proof that evidence can outlast ego and that community can outshine control. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?